Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the M365 Voice. I'm Sarah Haase.
And I am Mike Madarani.
And I'm Antonio Mayo.
Lovely. How are you all doing today?
Good.
Good. Are you ready to dive right in?
We're going to pick another question from the jar today.
Yep, here we go. What tips would you give for people who don't feel heard in their work meetings?
Oh,
this is a different topic.
All the time in work meetings and even in Microsoft 365 work meetings. This is an interesting one.
It's not a Microsoft 365 specific topic.
Exactly.
It is not. It's what tips would you give for people who don't feel heard in work meetings?
I think we all run across this sometimes in meetings, in work meetings. Mike, you and I being consultants, we will run across it in customer meetings sometimes. Right. Sometimes in sessions, if you lose control of a session, let's say, since we all speak at conferences or people interrupt you during sessions, that happens.
Mm-hmm.
That's an uncomfortable moment. I have been there. And they interrupt you and just hijack it and take it away. That's awkward, but the same thing can happen in work meetings. So kind of how do you feel heard, or how do you stay in an ownership perspective in those meetings?
Go ahead. I thought you wanted to say something like, okay, I'll let you go.
I was thinking and at the same time starting to say something. So I've witnessed this, but I've also had it happen to me sometimes. As a consultant, I don't see it happen to me much. We've talked about this, whereas consultants were brought in usually as experts. And when we're in customer meetings, it's a bit of a different context. Mm-hmm. But before being a consultant, I did work for a number of companies for about, probably 15 years, and sometimes saw it happen to me. Definitely witnessed it happen to other people. How about yourselves?
It's very similar experience. I think it's a different perspective when you are a consultant, because when you're dealing with clients and they invite you for do the work or any meetings or your opinion, just because they trust that you are the expert, they're hiring you as a consultant to come in and give them the best practices way to deploy the technology. So you're most often heard, and they let you speak more and explain what you have, and they sense if you are the expert or not. They sense if you know your stuff or not, because they will throw questions at you left and right, and you'll be ready to answer them. But yes, I have experienced it, or I've witnessed it with client meetings, when someone will hijack the meeting and will overspeak over others, and you kind of have to take back control and bring the topic to where the topic's supposed to be. So it's a little bit different perspective, yes, from a consulting world. And I've been a consultant for 21 years, whether with other companies or on my own. So that's the most experience I have. I don't remember myself happening to me in a meeting when I just started my career, because I just don't remember.
So I'm in a different position, not being a consultant and working for an organization. And it's definitely something that I see. And one of the things that I lead a lot of meetings. So if you're the leader of the meeting, I think that you need to take that as a proactive stance, right? If you're leading a meeting, then you're really responsible for the timing of that meeting, to make sure that the important topics are covered and to make sure those feeling or those key thoughts are heard. But I think it's actually harder sometimes for people when you're not part of a meeting. But when I see someone who has a really good idea, and maybe they keep getting interrupted. And it's so easy to do now during COVID when we're all remote, because if we're not on a video call like this one, you lose all the visual cues of Antonio's been trying to say something for a while now, or three people will start talking at the same time, and it can be easy, or maybe you're soft spoken. I'm not, but maybe if you're soft-spoken, right, you can have a hard time kind of getting your foot in the door. And one of the things that I always like to do is try and I know, Antonio, you and I have talked about this, is try and circle it back to that person. So if Mike were trying to say something, I'll circle it back and say, you know, I know, Mike, you were trying to cover something. But sometimes if I hear the same person kind of getting run over multiple times, I'll actually double down on that and I'll say something like, you know what, Mike, I'm really interested in the point that you were trying to make. I'd really like to hear that. And that kind of is enough of an added incentive that then if I say that, usually people will part the way enough to at least let him get his full thought out, because I've interrupted the meeting flow to call out that I'm interested in whatever he was going to say.
There's some really good points in what you said. There was like 3, I think, different personas that you talked about in that. You talked about the owner of the meeting, the person who is running the meeting or booked the meeting or is the owner of the meeting. To kind of repeat what you just said, I think they have a responsibility to be aware when that happens, when someone doesn't get to make their point or someone is getting run over, and they have a responsibility of letting that person be heard if they are willing to speak up. So I think that's one. Obviously, there's the person who's getting run over, right, or is not getting a chance to be heard. And I think when that happens, I have 2 minds of this, but the nicer side of me would say that person should always take the high road in the meeting and definitely should try to bring it back to their point, right? Saying to take the high road doesn't mean just give up and don't be heard. They should try to bring it back and to be heard, but always do it in a positive way, as opposed to, the person that interrupted them. It may have been meant, not in a nice way. They just might have no idea that they're interrupting them, but the person that was interrupted should still try to take the high road. And then you've got other people in the meetings that should try to be allies to the person who, if you notice this happening, to be an ally and try to bring it back to their point, because you're right. The person may be soft-spoken. They may not, they might get turned off by being interrupted or being interrupted too much, or they may just kind of give up on the meeting and decide, you know what, it's not worth me saying it. You don't really want people to go there if you can avoid it.
That's an interesting point. Question to both of you. So we get all the time into meetings, especially from a consulting world, and typically we are in control of the meeting because they invite us to go and talk about the M365, about how we implement, and we kind of come up with the agenda. But a lot of times also with clients, we don't own the meeting, so we're going to get invited to listen to them. So when this happens, when you see that someone is soft-spoken and not being listened to much, do you interrupt? Even if you're not the owner of the meeting, do you interrupt to kind of take control of it and bring back the subject, or give that person a chance to speak up?
Sometimes.
Yep. You're going to be shocked to hear that I am not shy about speaking up. I do. And, sometimes what I'll even do behind the scenes is if Antonio on a meeting keeps on trying to talk and isn't being heard, I will frequently send like a Teams chat message to Antonio and say, hey, I know you were trying to say something, would it be helpful if I kind of like interrupted or paved the way, right? So I'm reaching out to say, Antonio, how do you feel? Because Antonio may feel like, well, the point I had was already covered, or he may not want to say it, but if he really feels strongly about it, and I know that I've done this before, I think I've probably actually done it even with the 2 of you in a social construct setting of saying, hey, Mike, help me out. I have something to say. And I will do that and try and even behind the scenes of the meeting. And usually if somebody does that, other people will kind of throw up an elbow to help them out.
Yeah, I have actually very similar situations with a client that we are always in a meeting right now, and one of the participants always does not like to express himself on the meeting. So he will chat with me and say, can you speak that? Can you ask this question? I'm like, but I want you to raise your voice and I want you to speak about it. So I called him out a couple of times and like, oh, so-and-so is asking this question. Do you want to talk about it more? So I'd like to bring that aspect and make sure that everyone is heard in a Teams meeting. Otherwise, they'll assume that you don't have an opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important to do that so that people feel that they have the opportunity to be heard.
Exactly.
And some people are shy and sometimes they need a little nudge to come out of their shell. I like to err on the side of people do want to be heard. If they tell me afterwards, like, you know what, I really don't like to speak up in meetings, it really makes me uncomfortable, then I'll back off and I'll let it go. I usually err on the side of most people would want to be heard in a meeting.
I did a blog post on this one time because I had someone that I was mentoring, and she and I had this really interesting conversation where she was talking to me about a meeting that she was on, and she left the meeting with a horrible feeling. And it wasn't that she said something that she shouldn't have, but she left, and I think I dubbed it meeting regret. And it wasn't about something that she said that she thinks she said wrong. It was that once again, she didn't say anything when she had something to say. And I think that happens to people a lot. And it's a shame because it can, I think, really impact their confidence about if they don't feel heard in one meeting. I think it's a pattern that can really end up just delivering poor results from a work perspective for that person and for the company.
Yeah, I remember your blog post on that, actually. It was really good. Yeah, the idea of meeting regret, like regret happens not only because of stuff you do, but also stuff you didn't do. And even myself, I remember lots of situations where I regret not speaking up about something or not doing something. So yeah, I thought that was a really good point. What about conference sessions where this happens? Because we all speak at conferences quite regularly, right? Like a lot. So I'm sure we've all been in a situation where we're giving a session at a conference and a particular person keeps interrupting over and over and over and over. And how do you guys handle that? Or what are some ideas to handle that? It's a different context, right?
It is. Yes, like you said, it has happened probably to all of us. And you try to be polite at first and try to answer all the questions. And then you, if it keeps happening, you try to I try to answer them in a way that it is a long answer. We can probably take it offline, but I'm going to give you the short answer first because I'm trying to finish my presentation because I want to finish everything. I have a lot of good things to share with you. So if I focus on this topic, maybe it will cut out of my presentation time. So let's take it offline. I've learned that the hard way. Because sometimes if you don't kind of stop yourself and take control of the session, you're going to dig yourself in a big hole and you're going to go down that way. And then we only usually have an hour. And you don't realize that it has eaten probably a good 10 minutes out of your session, which is a long time. So it happened to me. And then it starts like kind of back and forth with one of them. And I'm like, yeah, we're going to have to stop that.
Yeah. I think being direct is key, and frankly, having friends and mentors or allies or people that you trust is helpful. I remember one time early on in my speaking career, I was at, and it was a relatively small session, but somebody started asking questions and it completely hijacked the rest of my session. And I frankly did not handle it well, but I happened to have a friend who was a fellow speaker who was sitting in on the session and afterwards sat me down and nicely but directly said, yeah, you could have really done that better. And while nobody likes to hear that, it's a good idea if you have friends that'll give you that authentic feedback of what they would recommend that you say. And it's exactly like what Mike said. I think sometimes you have to be direct. And it just happened to me a few weeks ago that I was having a conversation and someone was disagreeing with something that I was trying to get across. And they just kept on talking and talking, and I had a lot of people on the call that I needed to get the information clarified. So one of the things that I tend to do is if someone is talking over you and they just don't stop, right? And you're trying to get a word in edgewise. Sometimes just saying their name, their first name a few times in a row will get a little bit of a break where then you can kind of insert yourself a little bit. So in this case, just, softly, but, directly saying Antonio a couple of times will usually interrupt them enough that then you can get your foot in the door.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think being direct is important there, right? There's a big difference between, like, you can be direct without being rude to the person.
Correct.
And that's important to do, so that when you are direct, you're saying it with authority, right? You're saying it as, hang on, this is, without saying the words, you're essentially iterating, this is my meeting, this is my presentation, I need to get through this, please let me keep going, without being rude to the person, right? It's important to still take the high road, but be direct. And if you have to cut them off, right? Because the person, you have to remember, it's your session, you own it, you're giving it, and you need to, like Mike said, and I think you said, Sarah, take back control. Otherwise, you'll lose the rest of the session.
Yeah, and remember that you are in charge of the session. Yeah. This is your session. You own it. Yeah. And attendees are there to listen to you, to what you have to say, and to your expert opinion. Now, probably happened to all of us. We make mistakes. Technology changes on a weekly basis. Maybe we have not caught up to whatever you presented, and you might get corrected. And I'll take that in a positive way. But if I get interrupted and corrected and it's strong, I am firm with that. Maybe I come across a little bit meaner, but you have to know your stuff, and then make sure that the attendees are not doubting you anymore. Because once you lose control and you kind of start doubting yourself, that's not a good way to kind of finish your session.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an aside, but what you just said, Mike, made me remember something that I remember in a previous job that I had to do a lot of presenting technical issues to the CIO and to very senior leaders in the organization. And it was usually like a break fix situation. So it wasn't like, oh, happy day, here's a great thing that we did. It's something broke and it caused this big mess, and here's what we did about it. And it's one thing that I always learned, and I remember practicing it over and over and over again in the mirror, of just saying, you know what, that's a great question. I don't know the answer, but we'll look into it and I'll get back to you. And I said it to myself so many times to practice it, because I didn't want to go in, and I saw people sometimes who, if they didn't know the answer to a question, they would try and guesstimate the answer, or they try and lean into it. But sometimes you can get out ahead of your skis. And I think it's almost always okay, as long as you do follow up and say, you know what, I'm not sure. And being honest is good. I'm not sure, but I will look into that and get back to you. The thing is that then you have to look into it and get back to them. Right. But I think it's really important. And even as consultants, I'm assuming you get asked questions that you don't know the answer to.
Yes.
All the time.
Yeah. And you're right. Like what you just suggested, that's the best thing you can do with that situation, and say, you know what, I don't know that right now. I will look into it and get back to you. And then, of course, follow up and get back to them. But people usually appreciate that honesty, right? As opposed to trying to skate and worm an answer out of something, right? You don't want to do that, because you can easily get lost in that trap.
Mike and I both wrinkled up our nose at that, because here's the thing: if you're worming your way around to try and guesstimate the answer, how do they know that the next time when you know the answer that they're going to be able to trust in that?
Yeah.
That's right.
And that shows confidence. In my opinion, you get more confidence credits from the audience or the meeting attendees, that if you say, I don't know, but I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
You're not going to say, typically you don't say, I don't know for every question you get. But if you have some questions and you say you don't know, that's really very legit. And then there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you follow up. And typically in sessions, I will take the contact information, or I will share my contact information for them to contact me, and I'll follow up right away.
Yeah. Yeah. That, or you might blog about the answer too. I remember a few years ago, I would, if I get asked a question I couldn't answer, I'd like, okay, I'll take that away. I'll find an answer, and I'll blog about it. So check my blog in a few days, and then I'll go write that up, and I'll word the blog as, I gave this session. A person asked this great question. Here's the answer to it. Something like that.
Not to mention that gives you a great blog topic.
Yeah.
We
Absolutely.
For those of us that blog, we're always in search of a great blog topic.
Correct.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we've given a lot of tips around speaking, managing meetings, being in a meeting where you see a train wreck kind of happening, or someone who's just having a struggle, that you don't have to be the owner of the meeting to be an ally and to be someone who helps someone else to be heard. And hey, you'll feel great about it when you help that person out. So any final thoughts?
Be confident.
Yeah. And if it's your meeting, be aware of what's going on and take ownership of it, and make sure everyone in your meeting who wants to say something gets heard. Right? If you're the owner of the meeting, help those people out if they're getting interrupted.
I would agree. Don't be passive if it's your meeting.
Yeah.
Great. I love this topic. Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening in. We'll catch you next time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.